Somewhere along the edge of Africa, there is a coastline where the ocean never behaves the way it should, where thick fog can erase entire ships in minutes, and where the desert quietly swallows everything the sea leaves behind. This is the Skeleton Coast, a place where wrecked ships don't sink, they disappear into sand, where navigation fails without warning, and silence feels louder than sound. You are about to enter one of the most mysterious coastlines on Earth, a place where nature doesn't just surround you, it rewrites reality. From ancient shipwrecks buried deep in the desert, to freezing ocean currents that create deadly fog, to a coastline that is still changing today. Nothing here stays the same for long, and once you see it, you might never look at the ocean the same way again. There are places on Earth that feel like the edge of the world, where nature is not just powerful, but absolute. Places where survival is not guaranteed, where silence is heavier than sound, and where the horizon feels like it leads into something unknown. On the northwestern coast of Namibia, there is a stretch of land that has earned one of the most haunting names in geography. This is the Skeleton Coast, a place where desert meets ocean, and where countless ships have met their end. At first glance, it seems almost impossible. A vast desert of shifting sand stretches endlessly inland, while the cold Atlantic Ocean crashes violently against its edge. Two worlds that should never exist side by side here, locked in a constant struggle between land and sea. And within this fragile boundary lies a history shaped by wreckage, mystery, and survival. This coastline is part of Skeleton Coast, one of the most remote and unforgiving environments on the planet. To understand it is not simply to observe a landscape, but to step into a place where nature sets all the rules, and where human presence has always been temporary. Long before modern navigation, sailors feared this stretch of coast. Early explorers who ventured too close often never returned. Those who did speak of a shoreline hidden in thick, impenetrable fog, where visibility vanished without warning, and the sea seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was not just dangerous, it was disorienting, unpredictable, and silent in a way that unsettled even the most experienced mariners. Over time, the coastline earned its name, not from imagination, but from reality. Shipwrecks began to appear along its edge, their remains scattered across sand and rock. Some were torn apart by storms, others ran aground in the fog, unable to see the shore until it was too late. What was once water became desert again, as shifting sand slowly reclaimed the coastline, leaving ships stranded far from where they once floated. The atmosphere here is unlike anywhere else. A cold current moves along the Atlantic, bringing dense fog that rolls inland without warning. This fog can appear suddenly, wrapping everything in silence and reducing visibility to almost nothing. In these moments, the coastline disappears entirely, replaced by a white void where direction becomes impossible to judge. It is this combination of elements that makes the Skeleton Coast so unique. The desert does not end where the ocean begins. Instead, they overlap, creating a transition zone that is constantly changing. Sand dunes shift with the wind, waves reshape the shoreline, and fog alters perception entirely. Nothing here is fixed. Everything is in motion. For centuries, this environment remained largely untouched. Indigenous communities, such as the Himba people, lived on the edges of this harsh landscape, adapting to its extremes with knowledge passed down through generations. Their understanding of water sources, animal behavior, and seasonal change allowed them to survive in conditions that outsiders often found impossible. Yet for most travelers, this coastline represented danger rather than life. Ships that approached too closely often found themselves trapped between conflicting forces. Strong currents pushed them toward shore, while fog obscured every reference point. Once grounded, escape became nearly impossible. The ocean that brought them here would not take them back. As time passed, these wrecks became part of the landscape itself. Wooden hulls broke apart under wind and salt. Iron frames rusted into skeletal shapes, and sand slowly buried what remained. Some ships were swallowed entirely by dunes, leaving only fragments visible above the surface. Others remained half-exposed, as if frozen in the moment of their final journey. The name Skeleton Coast did not come from imagination alone. It reflects what can still be seen today. The remains of ships scattered across sand like bones, reminders of journeys that ended not in destination, but in disappearance. But this coastline is not only about destruction, it is also about endurance. Despite its harshness, life persists here in unexpected ways. Desert-adapted animals move through the dunes, surviving in conditions that seem impossible at first glance. The environment is extreme, but not empty. Even the ocean plays a paradoxical role. While it brings danger through fog and currents, it also supports marine life along the coast. Seals gather in large colonies, feeding in cold waters rich with nutrients brought by the Benguela Current. The contrast between abundance and danger defines this entire region. There is a strange balance here between presence and absence, between what is seen and what is hidden. The skeleton coast does not reveal itself easily. It demands patience, attention, and respect. It is not a place of comfort. It is a place of understanding. This coastline is not just a location on a map. It is a threshold between worlds, between survival and loss, between memory and erosion. And as the wind moves across the dunes and the ocean continues its relentless rhythm, it becomes evident that here, nature is not a backdrop.
Most of the world has settled into fixed, familiar shapes. Every coastline is drawn on every map, every mountain range marked as permanent, every boundary set for generations. Most people assume the Earth finished shaping itself millions of years ago, but that is not the whole truth. There are still corners of the planet where the work never ends, places where nature never settled into a final, unchanging form. One of those places sits on the southwestern edge of Africa, where hot desert meets the cold Atlantic. It is called the Skeleton Coast. And here, the idea of fixed, finished land dies completely. The ground does not stay still. It shifts with every gust of wind, breathes with the turn of the tides, and reshapes itself faster than humans can record. Draw a clear line between desert and ocean on a paper map, and the coast will erase that line before the ink dries. There is no hard, permanent boundary. No dividing line that stays put from one year to the next. It is a living, moving transition, forever changing, forever blending one world into another. The desert spills into the ocean in thin streams of fine sand. The ocean creeps inland, leaving crusts of salt and shattered rock in its wake. Neither side ever wins. Neither side ever stops pushing to claim more space. As you travel further inland from the shore, the first thing you notice is how empty it looks. No trees, no buildings, no sign of permanent life anywhere. The wide expanse of sand, stretching to the horizon, feels still, like a frozen canvas that stopped changing the day it was created. But that stillness is an illusion. Look closer, and the motion is everywhere, unceasing and invisible, until you train your eye to see it. Fine grains of sand lift off the crest of a dune, carried east by a steady wind, dropping one by one onto the sheltered back slope. The dune does not just sit there. It moves. It crawls inland, swallowing anything that stands in its path. Some dunes rise 30 meters high in the space of a single season. Others collapse completely when the wind shifts direction, their entire structure scattering in a matter of days. Further out, the Atlantic does the same work. It pushes forward an extra 100 meters during high tide, dragging sand and rock back with it when it pulls out. At low tide, new flats of salt-crusted earth are exposed, hard and sharp under any foot that steps on them. By the next high tide, those same flats will be submerged again, covered by cold, dark water, reshaped before they are exposed again. Nothing holds its shape. Nothing stays where it is put. Even the air that brushes over the sand carries a constant, low hum of motion, holding fine salt particles that grind away at any solid surface left exposed. Every part of this landscape is working, all the time. No rest, no end. The first sign of fog is not a sight, it's a change in temperature. The warm desert air that carried sand across the dunes suddenly cools, drops 10 degrees in one breath. The salt tang in the air thickens, coats your lips with fine, damp film before you spot any change. Then it arrives, not creeping slow, like fog does in other places. It rolls off the Atlantic in a solid wall, swallowing everything in its path without a sound. First, it blurs the distant dune crests you use to mark direction. Then, it erases the horizon completely. The line between sky and sand vanishes, leaving nothing but uniform pale gray that hurts your eyes to stare at. You turn back to the dune you stood on 5 minutes ago, and it's gone. Vanished as if it never existed. You think you can still navigate by the sound of the ocean. The crash of waves will always lead you back to shore. But the fog does something to sound. It absorbs it, mutes it, pulls it out of the air so you can't tell where it comes from. 1 minute you hear the roar of the surf clear to your left. The next, it's a faint hum everywhere and nowhere. In 3 minutes flat, every landmark you counted on is gone. Every sense you rely on for direction stops working. Storms roar and give warning. This fog gives nothing. It just arrives, takes all information, leaves you adrift in a world without shape or direction. That is why sailors feared this coast more than any storm. For centuries, it has swallowed ships whole without a sound, turning a familiar voyage into an unknown grave before anyone could react.
Is where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Namib Desert in one of the most extreme intersections on Earth. The cold Benguela Current rises from the depths of the ocean, carrying nutrient-rich waters along the coast. At the same time, the desert heat pushes outward from the land. When these two forces meet, condensation forms rapidly, creating the dense fog that has become one of the defining features of this region. There is no gradual transition here. The ocean ends, and the desert begins almost immediately. Waves crash against sand instead of rock in many areas, eroding the shoreline in unpredictable ways. Some sections of coast shift inward over time, while others are pushed outward by wind-blown sediment. Nothing remains fixed for long. Traveling along this coastline, one begins to notice how silence dominates the environment. It is not absolute silence, but something layered and subtle. The sound of wind moving across dunes, the distant crash of waves, the occasional call of seabirds. Yet these sounds feel isolated, as if they belong to separate worlds that rarely meet. In certain moments, the fog rolls in so quickly that the entire landscape disappears. Dunes vanish, the ocean vanishes, even the sky loses definition. Everything becomes white, then gray, then undefined. In these conditions, perception becomes unreliable. Distance cannot be measured. Movement becomes disorienting. It is within this environment that many ships once lost their way. Navigation depended on visibility, stars, and landmarks. Here, all three could be erased within minutes. The coastline offered no warning. Ships that believed they were far from shore could suddenly find themselves grounded in sand, unable to reverse their course. Over time, these accidents became part of the land itself. The ocean no longer reaches many of the wreck sites today. Instead, the desert has reclaimed them. Sand has advanced inland, carrying dunes over old hulls, burying wood and metal beneath layers of shifting earth. What remains visible are fragments, rusted beams, broken frames, and shapes that no longer resemble their original form. These remnants are not preserved in stillness. They continue to change. Wind erodes metal. Salt accelerates decay. Sand reshapes everything it touches. A shipwreck here is not frozen in time. It is slowly being absorbed back into the environment that ended its journey. Yet, the skeleton coast is not defined only by destruction. It is also a place of adaptation. Life exists here in forms that seem impossible at first. Small organisms thrive in the fog, drawing moisture directly from the air. Plants survive with minimal water, anchored deep in shifting sand. Even larger animals have learned to navigate this harsh environment. Seals gather in large colonies along certain stretches of coast, taking advantage of the rich marine life supported by the cold current. Their presence adds unexpected movement and sound to an otherwise quiet landscape. In contrast to the emptiness of the dunes, these coastal areas feel almost alive with activity. Further inland, survival becomes more complex, yet still possible. Some species travel long distances between water sources. Others rely entirely on moisture extracted from fog. Every form of life here is adapted to scarcity, shaped by conditions that would overwhelm most ecosystems. Human presence in this region has always been limited. Even today, it remains one of the least populated coastal areas in the world. Those who travel here do so with preparation and respect for the environment's unpredictability. There are no easy paths, no guaranteed routes. Every journey depends on reading the land and understanding its shifting nature. As the day progresses, light changes everything once again. In the morning, the coast appears soft and muted, with fog diffusing sunlight into pale tones. By midday, when the fog clears, harsh contrasts emerge between bright sand and deep blue ocean. By evening, shadows stretch across the dunes, and the landscape becomes more dramatic, almost surreal in its scale and emptiness. What makes this place unforgettable is not just its appearance, but its instability. Nothing here is permanent. Not the shoreline, not the dunes, not even the memory of shipwrecks, which continue to be reshaped by wind and time. The skeleton coast does not offer answers. It offers perspective. It shows how fragile direction can be, how quickly certainty can dissolve, and how nature operates on scales far beyond human control. This is not just a coastline. It is a system in motion, a place where land, sea, air, and time are constantly rewriting each other, without pause, without end. There are stories written in maps, and then there are stories written in silence. Along the skeleton coast, silence carries more history than any archive ever could. It is not empty silence. It is layered, heavy with memory, shaped by centuries of arrival and disappearance. Long before modern navigation and satellite tracking, this coastline was already feared, already misunderstood, already respected in a way few places on Earth ever are. As we move deeper into Skeleton Coast, the perspective shifts from landscape to history. This is not just a stretch of land where ocean meets desert. It is a threshold where countless journeys ended before they were ever completed. For early explorers, this coast was not a destination. It was a warning. Sailors approaching from the Atlantic often described the same experience. At first, open water and clear skies. Then, without warning, a wall of fog. Not thin mist, but something dense enough to erase direction itself. In those moments, compasses became unreliable, landmarks disappeared, and even the horizon ceased to exist. The ocean, once a guide, became a trap. This is where reputation began to form. Not through myth, but through repetition. Ship after ship lost in the same conditions. Crew after crew reporting the same confusion. The same confusion. The same sudden grounding. The same inability to distinguish sea from shore until it was already too late. Over time, the coastline earned a name that reflected its reality more than its beauty. For those who survived, the experience was unforgettable. They spoke of silence that felt unnatural, of winds that changed direction without warning, of currents that pulled vessels toward unseen dangers. And when wrecks occurred, rescue was rarely possible. The coastline offered no shelter, no safe harbor, no predictable path back to open sea. Many of the earliest recorded shipwrecks along this region were never fully documented at the time they occurred. Some vessels simply vanished from maritime records, their final positions only discovered later, if at all. Others were found long after their destruction, broken apart by waves and partially buried by sand, their origins difficult to trace. Over time, the coastline became known not just for accidents, but for transformation. Ships that once crossed oceans became part of the land itself. Wood turned to fragments, metal twisted under salt and wind. Entire hulls slowly absorbed into dunes that continued to move long after the water had retreated. One of the most striking aspects of this history is how the desert and ocean compete for control. At times, the sea advances, reshaping the shoreline. At other times, wind-driven sand pushes inward, reclaiming space from the water. This constant negotiation means that the location of shipwrecks is never fixed. What is exposed today may be buried tomorrow. What is inland today may once have been coastline. Among the many remnants scattered along this coast, some wrecks have become iconic examples of this transformation. Vessels that once floated freely are now stranded far from any navigable water. Their final resting places tell a story not just of failure, but of time itself moving the boundary between land and sea. One such example is the Eduard Bolin, a German cargo ship that now lies stranded deep within the desert. What makes it remarkable is not only its condition, but its position. It is no longer near the ocean. It is surrounded entirely by sand, as if the land itself swallowed the sea and left the ship behind as evidence. These wrecks are not preserved like museum pieces. They are exposed to constant erosion. Wind strips away surfaces. Saul corrodes structure. Sand acts like both blanket and tool, sometimes covering, sometimes revealing. Every year changes them slightly. Every season reshapes what remains visible. The coastline does not allow stillness. Even history here is in motion. Yet, despite the danger, this region was never completely avoided. Trade routes still passed nearby. Exploration continued. Navigation improved. But the Skeleton Coast remained a place of caution, always approached carefully, never underestimated. The reason was simple. It was not just one hazard. It was many overlapping hazards acting at once. Fog that erased.
A modern cargo vessel's navigation system flickers 10 nautical miles off the skeleton coast. The charted coastline it displays does not match what the radar sees. The captain adjusts the receiver, refreshes the satellite feed, and waits. He checks the depth sounder next. The readings jump 20 fathoms in 10 seconds, no visible ridge to explain the shift. The new overlay still does not align. This is not a malfunction. This is how the skeleton coast works. Currents alter course without warning. Winds shift direction faster than any forecast can predict. Sandbanks move across the shoreline, pushed by tides and storms, never staying anchored in one place. The coastline itself reshapes year after year, journey after journey. No surveyor has ever left this region with a final, permanent map. By the time their data is printed or uploaded, the coast has already changed. Every new survey contradicts the last, even when taken only months apart. Even today, every vessel that passes this stretch of shore keeps constant watch on their navigation systems. Every crew is warned before they enter the region. No one takes the map they loaded at port for granted. Respect is non-negotiable here. It is not unknowable. It is simply never the same. Any plan that assumes it will hold still is already a plan doomed to fail. As centuries of ships pass through these waters, stories accumulated faster than sand built up around half-buried wrecked hulls. Some accounts were rooted in hard fact. Others grew more exaggerated with every telling, shaped by the fear that comes with hundreds of miles of empty ocean and no other ships for days. Sailors told of entire cargo fleets that sailed into a thick bank of fog and never emerged. Search parties sent after them found no debris, no life rafts, no trace of any vessel ever being there. Other accounts talk of standing on deck at night, hearing the roar of crashing waves throwing themselves against the shore. But when the crew scanned the horizon, there was nothing but open sea. No breakers, no shoreline, just the sound, growing louder, then fading as quickly as it came. Many of these stories were passed down verbally from one crew to the next, from one generation of sailors to the next. Each retelling added a small new detail, a little more weight to the quiet unease. Isolation and uncertainty warp perception. Out here where there is nothing but open ocean and a constantly shifting coast, what started as a misread depth sounding or a trick of wind on water becomes a supernatural encounter in the telling. Even sailors who openly dismiss most legends will change course to avoid a patch of thick fog along this coast. No one is willing to test the odds. No one wants to become the next story added to the region's growing list. Beneath all the legends, all the exaggerated stories and blurred lines between fact and fantasy, there is a simple, unchanging truth. The skeleton coast does not hunt ships. It does not curse sailors. It just is. It is a place where human control always hits a hard limit, where every plan, every carefully plotted course, every ambitious voyage built on human certainty runs straight into the unrelenting shift of natural systems that have moved here for millions of years before the first ship ever set sail. The skeleton coast does not preserve human ambition. It dissolves it, slowly, grain by grain of sand. Every wreck that runs aground here is gradually pulled apart by waves, buried by shifting dunes, rusted away by salt wind, until all that remains of a great steel vessel is a few twisted fragments poking out of the sand. Every vanished voyage, every lost crew, every fragment of metal or wood becomes part of the coast's ongoing shift. This is not a story of loss. Not really. It is a reminder that here, nature does not fight human history. It does not compete with it. It simply absorbs it. Unlike other places where human history sits locked in stone or recorded in books, here time does not freeze the past. It carries it along, reshapes it, integrates it back into the land and sea that were here first. All that remains is the quiet, unshakable awe of standing on a shore that reminds every visitor, you are not in control here. You are just passing through.
Erase. It transforms. What was once movement becomes stillness. What was once journey becomes structure. and what was once ocean becomes desert. In this strange reversal, the remains of ships tell stories that continue even after their final voyage ended. As the exploration continues along Skeleton Coast, the focus shifts from fear and navigation to what remains behind. Not the moment of disaster, but the long aftermath. The slow transformation of human engineering into natural form. Here, shipwrecks are not rare events hidden beneath waves. They are exposed, scattered, and slowly absorbed into sand and silence. One of the most haunting aspects of this coastline is how visible its history is. Unlike deep ocean wrecks that remain hidden, here the remains of vessels are part of the surface itself. Rusted hulls rise from dunes. Broken beams stretch across sand like skeletal remains. Hull plates bend under decades of wind, salt, and erosion. Nothing is preserved in the traditional sense. Everything is in transition. The process begins the moment a ship is grounded. Once stranded in shallow sandbanks or pushed ashore by fog and currents, escape becomes nearly impossible. The ocean, which once carried these vessels across continents, now becomes an inaccessible boundary just beyond reach. Waves continue to crash in the distance, but the ship remains fixed, slowly shifting from vessel to relic. At first, the structure remains recognizable. Names may still be visible on metal. Plating, railings, decks, and cabins still hold form, but the environment does not allow stability. Wind carries sand across surfaces like a constant abrasive force. Salt from the ocean accelerates corrosion. Temperature shifts weaken structural integrity. Over time, the transformation becomes irreversible. Wooden sections decay or disappear entirely. Metal bends under pressure it was never designed to withstand. Open spaces collapse inward. What remains is no longer a ship in any functional sense, but a shape occupying space within the landscape. This is how vessels like the Edward Boleyn came to rest far from the sea. Once a cargo ship navigating open waters, it is now located deep inland, surrounded entirely by dunes. Its position is not static. It reflects the movement of the coastline itself over time. What was once shoreline has shifted, leaving the wreck stranded in what is now pure desert. This movement of land is one of the most important forces shaping the Skeleton Coast. Sand does not remain in place. It travels, driven by wind patterns that have existed for thousands of years. Entire dunes migrate slowly across the terrain, sometimes burying objects completely, sometimes revealing them again years later. As a result, the coastline behaves like a living archive that constantly rewrites itself. A wreck visible today may be gone tomorrow. Another that was buried decades ago may reappear after a shift in wind direction. Nothing here is permanent. The silence.
You stand on sun-baked sand, 100 miles from the nearest ocean. The sun beats down on the back of your neck, and the silence presses in so thick you can almost feel it. No wind moves, no birds call. Nothing moves across the flat expanse between you and the horizon. Imagination fills the gaps left by time and wind. It is easy to picture the screaming of rigging, the crush of hull on rock, the panic of men fighting to stay afloat as the sea dragged their voyage off course. But the desert does not preserve drama. It does not freeze a moment of chaos for visitors to find. It only preserves aftermath. Some wrecks lie partially intact, their outlines still sharp against the hazy desert horizon. Others have been torn apart by wind and sand, their fragments scattered across a dozen square miles of empty ground. In the most worn cases, only isolated pieces of structure remain. They poke out of the sand at odd angles, barely identifiable to the untrained eye without maps or context. Each broken piece becomes a marker. It does not mark what was lost in the final moments. It marks only what once existed here, in this stretch of empty desert that once sat under open ocean. Decay does not stop at breaking these structures apart. Over generations of wind and shifting sand, the decaying metal and wood slowly merge with the desert around them. What was once entirely shaped by human hands does not remain a foreign object on the sand forever. This integration does not happen overnight. It does not happen in a single human lifetime. It takes decades, sometimes centuries, of slow, constant change before the wreck becomes indistinguishable from the natural landscape. Even in their broken state, the structures block wind, trap sand, and cast shade in a landscape that has almost no shelter. Birds land on exposed metal beams to rest during the midday heat, escaping the burning sun that beats across the open dunes. Seeds blow across the sand and get caught in the gaps between wreck sections, where collected moisture lets them sprout. Hardy desert plants take root near the sheltered lower edges of the wrecks, growing taller and hardier than they would in the unprotected open. Even small desert animals, from lizards to burrowing rodents, use the hollow broken sections of the wrecks as temporary cover from predators and extreme temperature shifts. No one planned these new uses. No one designed these wrecks to be habitat, but the desert repurposes everything it is given and slowly turns what was once a ship into a new part of its living system. Stand beside one of these half-buried wrecks, and the contradiction hits you immediately. Your mind knows what it is looking at. The hull of a ship, a structure built to cut through open water, to carry men and cargo across waves. Your brain expects salt spray on your skin, the roar of surf under the keel, the endless blue stretch of ocean stretching out to the horizon. Instead, you get sand under your boots, hot wind that carries only fine grit, and empty desert stretching out as far as the eye can see. There is no water here, no movement of tides, no navigation possible for any vessel. What was once a tool for moving across the world is now locked in stillness, rooted deep in shifting sand. This contradiction is not a mistake or a random accident. It is the physical proof of a core truth about this landscape. Nothing here is separate. Nothing stays fixed in its original purpose forever. The same force that pushed the ocean up over this land, pushing ships far inland, is the same force that now slowly drags sand over the wrecks, feeds plants in their shelter, and lets animals make their homes in their broken frames. Human intention, ocean power, and desert wind are all threads in the same continuous, ever-moving process. Even in decay, these wrecks do not reach a point of finality. They keep changing, keep being repurposed, keep moving along with the world around them. A wreck here is not an end. It is just one more step in the endless, unbroken process of change.
Endpoint. It is a stage in transformation. The skeleton coast does not preserve history in a traditional way. It dissolves it gradually, redistributing it into the landscape. Metal becomes texture. Wood becomes dust. Structure becomes form without function. These wrecks are not just reminders of disaster. They are evidence of time acting on human ambition. Proof that here, nothing remains as it was, and everything eventually becomes part of something larger than itself. There are places where the boundary between reality and illusion becomes so thin that even the most experienced traveler begins to question what they are seeing. On the skeleton coast, this boundary is shaped not by imagination, but by fog, light, and distance that refuses to behave in predictable ways. Here, the ocean does not simply meet the land. It rewrites it every day in silence. As the journey continues deeper into Skeleton Coast, one force becomes impossible to ignore. It is not the wind, not the sand, and not even the waves. It is the fog, a dense, shifting presence that arrives without warning and changes everything it touches. This fog is born where cold ocean currents meet warm desert air. The Atlantic here is driven by the Benguela Current, one of the coldest ocean currents in the world. It rises from deep waters and moves north along the African coast, carrying with it nutrients, temperature shifts, and a constant sense of unpredictability. When this cold water meets the heat rising from the Namib Desert, condensation forms instantly. The result is a fog so thick it can erase the world in seconds. Within this fog, distance loses meaning. A dune that seemed close moments ago disappears completely. The ocean, once visible as a horizon, becomes a wall of gray. Even sound behaves differently, absorbed and scattered before it can travel far. It is in these conditions that many of the coast's most infamous shipwrecks occurred. Sailors approaching this coastline often believed they were far from danger. Navigation at sea depended on visibility, and in clear conditions, the Atlantic offered open, readable space. But the Skeleton Coast does not remain clear for long. Fog can roll in suddenly, moving inland like a living force, swallowing everything in its path. Many ships that entered this region never had time to adjust. One moment, open water. The next, nothing. No horizon, no shoreline, no reference point, only the sound of waves that could not be placed in space. In such conditions, even experienced captains lost orientation. The coastline offered no mercy for small errors. A slight miscalculation in direction could lead a vessel directly into sandbanks hidden beneath shallow water. Once grounded, escape became nearly impossible. The ocean that had carried the ship here would no longer be accessible in the same way. Waves would continue to move, but now they would push against a fixed point instead of guiding it forward. This is how many wrecks became part of the landscape. Not through violent storms, but through quiet disorientation, a slow transition from movement to stillness, from navigation to entrapment. Among the many vessels that met this fate, some have become symbols of the coastline's identity, not because of their size or fame, but because of how completely they were absorbed into the environment. One of the most striking examples remains the remains of ships scattered across both coastal and inland areas, where sand has redefined their final resting places. What makes these wrecks so haunting is not just their condition, but their placement. Some lie close to the ocean, partially exposed during low tide, surrounded by shifting water and sand. Others are far inland, as if the desert itself carried them away from the sea over time. This movement is not imagined. It is the result of constant geological change. Wind-driven sand acts like a slow current. Over decades, it reshapes entire sections of coastline. Dunes migrate, sometimes covering wrecks entirely, sometimes revealing new parts of them. What is visible today may not be visible next year. The landscape refuses to settle into a final form. In this environment, even the concept of a final position loses meaning. A shipwreck is not anchored in place. It is part of a moving system. The land around it changes faster than the structure itself decays, creating the illusion that the wreck is traveling through time while remaining still. The silence that surrounds the sites is not empty. It is layered. Wind moving across metal produces subtle tones. Sand shifting inside hollow structures creates faint internal sounds. Even the ocean, though often distant, contributes a constant low rhythm that never fully disappears. Standing among these wrecks creates a strange sense of scale. Human construction, once designed for distance and travel, now exists in a place where movement has been removed entirely. The contrast between intention and outcome becomes visible in every rusted edge and broken beam. The skeleton coast does not preserve failure in a dramatic way. It simply continues to exist beyond it. There is no final moment captured here, only long processes of change. Metal becomes fragile, wood becomes texture, paint disappears, names fade, and eventually, recognition itself begins to dissolve. Yet, even in decay, these structures continue to interact with their environment. Birds use exposed surfaces as resting points. Small desert life moves through gaps in collapsed frames. In some cases, plants grow around the edges of wreckage, slowly integrating human remains into natural cycles. The fog remains the most defining force in all of this. It is both creator and eraser. It hides the coastline, then reveals it again in fragments. It shaped the conditions that led to many of these wrecks, and it continues to influence how they are seen today. There is something deeply disorienting about this constant uncertainty. Nothing stays visible long enough to become familiar. The coast is always partially hidden, always partially revealed. It resists complete understanding, not the wrecks themselves, but the forces that created them. Fog, current, wind, and sand working together in a system that does not pause for human interpretation. As the coastline fades in and out of visibility, one realization becomes clear. The skeleton coast is not a place that can be fully seen at once. It is a place that must be experienced in fragments, each moment revealing only part of a much larger, constantly shifting truth. There are places where the danger is not what you can see, but what you cannot escape, even when you understand it completely. On the skeleton coast, that danger is not a storm or a cliff. It is something quieter, colder, and far more persistent, a force that shapes everything here without ever announcing itself. As the journey moves deeper into Skeleton Coast, the ocean begins to feel different. It is no longer just water meeting land. It becomes a moving system of temperature, pressure, and invisible currents that control everything along this shoreline. This is where the Benguela Current dominates the Atlantic edge of southern Africa. It rises from the deep ocean, carrying cold water from polar regions upward along the coast. That cold water does something powerful when it reaches this part of the world. It changes the air above it. It creates one of the most unpredictable atmospheric systems on Earth. The result is not just fog. It is a living layer of condensation that forms, collapses, and reforms without warning. It can appear in minutes, turning a clear horizon into a blank wall. It can disappear just as quickly, revealing landscapes that feel completely different from what was there before. This is why so many stories from sailors along this coast describe a sense of confusion rather than fear. Fear implies something visible, what they encountered, was not always visible. It was absence. The absence of direction, the absence of reference, the absence of certainty. In open ocean, navigation depends on continuity. Stars, waves, wind patterns, and sunlight all create a readable system. But here, that system breaks down. The fog interrupts sight. The current alters movement. The coastline itself shifts slowly beneath the surface. Nothing remains stable long enough to fully trust. When ships entered this zone in earlier centuries, they often believed they were still far from land. The ocean appears vast, open, and safe when visibility is normal. But the skeleton coast does not announce its proximity. It waits until the final moment when correction is no longer possible. Many vessels only realized they were close to shore when it was already too late. The sound of waves changes before the sight of land appears. The water becomes shallower, the motion sharper, and then suddenly, the sand beneath the surface rises where it should not. Grounding here is not a single impact. It is a sequence. First contact, then resistance, then immobilization. Once a ship is trapped in shallow sandbanks, the ocean no longer supports movement. Instead, it becomes a force pushing against recovery. Over time, these grounded ships became permanent parts of the coastline, not preserved, but absorbed. The environment does not freeze them, it transforms them. Salt carried from the ocean begins to eat into exposed metal. Wind carries fine sand that acts like constant abrasion. Temperature changes expand and contract remaining structures until they weaken further. Every element here participates in the same process. Nothing is neutral. Everything contributes to change. Even the fog plays a role in this transformation. It limits visibility, not just for navigation, but for perception of decay. A wreck may appear and disappear depending on atmospheric conditions. One day it is fully visible. The next it is gone inside gray silence. This intermittent visibility creates a strange relationship between memory and presence. A structure that cannot always be seen begins to feel uncertain in its existence, even though it remains physically unchanged. Further inland, some wrecks show how far this transformation can go. Entire ships now rest far from the ocean, surrounded only by sand and wind. The shoreline that once defined their position has moved, leaving them isolated in what is now pure desert. This is not a sudden shift. It is slow movement over decades. Sand carried by persistent wind reshapes the coastline centimeter by centimeter. What once marked the edge of the ocean becomes land, and what was once water becomes memory. The most striking part of this environment is that it does not preserve contrast. It blends everything into continuity. Ocean becomes sand. Sand becomes distance. Distance becomes silence. Even the soundscape reflects this blending. There are moments when everything disappears into stillness. No wave noise, no wind pressure, no movement detectable by ear alone. Then, suddenly, sound returns in layers. A distant crash, a shifting dune, a seabird call carried far beyond its source. This unpredictability is what makes the skeleton coast so difficult to fully comprehend. It does not behave like a fixed environment. It behaves like a process. Modern exploration has confirmed what early sailors experienced intuitively. The coastline is not stable. It is dynamic at every scale. Ocean currents shift temperature. Wind patterns reshape terrain. Fog alters perception. Sand modifies structure. Everything is active at once. Even technology does not simplify it completely. Satellite images show the coastline differently depending on time and atmospheric conditions. A clear image can be replaced hours later by fog coverage or sand movement. And yet, despite all of this instability, there is order here. Not human order, but natural order. A system that operates without pause or intention. Cold water rises. Warm air responds. Fog forms. Sand moves. Structures decay. The cycle continues without interruption. Standing within this system changes perception. It becomes clear that danger here is not an event. It is a condition, a continuous state, rather than a moment. And in that realization, the skeleton coast becomes something more than a location. It becomes an example of how environments can operate beyond human expectation, beyond control, and beyond permanence. As this part closes, the ocean continues its movement without reference to anything that has been lost within it. The fog continues to form without memory of what it hides. And the coast continues to shift, slowly rewriting every trace of what once stood still. There are places where survival is not a choice, but a constant negotiation with the environment. On the skeleton coast, life does not spread easily. It adapts quietly, slowly, and only in forms strong enough to endure conditions that seem almost impossible. Here, every living thing is part of a system shaped by scarcity, distance, and relentless change. As the journey continues across Skeleton Coast, the focus shifts away from wreckage and weather and towards something even more remarkable. Life itself. Not abundant life, not comfortable life, but life that exists at the edge of what is possible. At first glance, the coastline appears empty. Endless dunes stretch toward the horizon, broken only by occasional rocky outcrops and the distant line of the Atlantic. The fog still moves in and out, reshaping of sand. But within this apparent emptiness, movement exists. It is just harder to notice. One of the most striking forms of life here is the desert-adapted wildlife that has learned to survive without predictable water sources. These animals do not depend on rivers or lakes. Instead, they rely on timing, instinct, and an understanding of invisible environmental patterns that humans can barely perceive. Among the most resilient are the desert-adapted elephants. They move across vast distances in search of vegetation that appears only in specific conditions. Their paths are not random. They are inherited knowledge, passed through generations, mapped not in lines but in memory. These elephants remember where moisture gathers, where fog settles longest, and where rare vegetation survives beneath the surface of sand. Their movement across the landscape is slow but deliberate. Each step is part of a larger pattern of survival that has developed over time. In a place where water is never guaranteed, even movement becomes a strategy. Further along the coast, another form of survival appears in unexpected density. Seal colonies gather along certain stretches where cold ocean currents bring nutrients close to shore. These colonies are loud, active, and constantly shifting. In contrast to the silence of the desert, these coastal zones feel alive with motion and sound. Thousands of seals cluster together, feeding, resting, and interacting in an environment shaped entirely by ocean. Productivity. Their survival depends on the Benguela Current, which brings cold, nutrient-rich water from deep ocean layers to the surface. This current supports one of the richest marine ecosystems in the world, even as it contributes to the harsh fog that defines the coastline. Above the sand and surf, birds circle constantly. Some are drawn to marine life, others to inland resources that appear only seasonally. Their flight patterns trace invisible lines between ocean and desert, connecting two environments that seem separate but are deeply linked. Even insects and smaller organisms play a role in this system. Many survive by responding to fog moisture, extracting water directly from air or from surfaces cooled by condensation. In such an environment, even the air becomes a resource. Human life, though limited, is also part of this ecosystem. Small communities along the edges of this region, including groups such as the Hemba people, have historically adapted to extreme conditions with remarkable knowledge of land, water, and seasonal change. Their survival techniques are not based on control, but on understanding patterns and respecting limits. They read the environment differently. Where others see emptiness, they see signals. Where others see unpredictability, they recognize cycles. Their relationship with the land is not about overcoming it, but about existing within its rhythm. Deeper inland, survival becomes even more complex. Vegetation is sparse and widely scattered. Water sources are hidden, often temporary, and highly dependent on rare climatic conditions. Yet even here, life persists. Plants with deep root systems extract moisture far below the surface. Some species remain dormant for long periods, waiting for the right conditions to reappear. What makes this ecosystem extraordinary is not its abundance, but its efficiency. Nothing is wasted. Every form of life has a role defined by limitation. Scarcity does not prevent existence. It shapes it. Even the fog, which once appeared as a threat to navigation, becomes a source of life. It condenses on surfaces, providing moisture in a place where rainfall is minimal. Leaves, rocks, and sand all become temporary collection points for water. Over time, this subtle process sustains entire micro-ecosystems. In this way, the Skeleton Coast reveals a paradox. What appears hostile is also sustaining. What appears empty is also active. What appears silent is also full of life, operating on different scales. But survival here is never guaranteed. It is conditional, dependent on timing, adaptation, and constant movement. A single shift in weather patterns can alter food availability. A change in wind direction can reshape access to moisture. Nothing remains stable long enough to become permanent security. This constant uncertainty is what defines life here. Not struggle alone, but adaptation without end. And yet, despite everything, the system holds. Not because it is easy, but because it is. You step onto the sand of Skeleton Coast at first light. The wind carries the sharp salt tang of the Atlantic, and the silence presses in, thick enough to touch. At first glance, it looks like nothing lives here. Just open sand, endless ocean, and the slow drift of fog off the water. You turn to scan the horizon, and the first connection reveals itself. The ocean pulls cold water up from the deep, and that cold cools the air above the shore. Water vapor condenses, and fog is born, rolling inland to blanket the dunes in a soft, cold shroud. That fog deposits fine moisture that would never fall as rain here, enough to feed the small, tough plants that cling to the cracks between sand grains. Those plants hold the dunes in place, stopping the wind from shifting the entire coast into new shape every single day. The ocean shaped the fog shaped the land shaped what can grow and move here. Every movement of every living thing depends on that unbroken chain of cause and effect. It is not an empty wasteland. It is not random chaos. Every element responds to another, locking into a quiet balance that has held for thousands of years. It is harsh, unforgiving, but completely cohesive. Standing within this working system, one realization becomes unavoidable, cutting through every assumption you brought to this shore. Most stories of survival in harsh places center on dominance, on beating the elements, outsmarting the land, forcing it to bend to your will. That framework does not work here. The Skeleton Coast does not kill everything it turns away by accident. It does not fight intruders to win a war. It simply follows its own rhythm, unchanging and unapologetic. It is not empty, it is selective. It does not support every form of life, but what it does support is deeply woven into every part of its pattern. It rejects anything that demands more than it gives, anything that tries to tear its existing structure apart to fit a foreign design. Those that stay do not fight the conditions, they align with them. This is the shift that rewrites every idea of survival you ever held. It is no longer about overcoming the environment. It is no longer about conquering the extremes of the land. It is about becoming part of it. Dominance gives way to alignment. Conquest gives way to integration. The whole idea of survival shifts from a battle to a dance, matched to the slow, ancient rhythm of the coast. This insight is not a new discovery for outsiders traveling the shore. For generations, indigenous communities living along the edge of this coast have carried this knowledge, built their entire relationship with the land around it. They did not come here to conquer the empty wasteland, did not set out to bend the harsh conditions to their will. They built their way of life on slow, patient observation, learning every shift in the wind, every pattern of the fog, every turn of the tide that shapes the coast day after day. Among these groups is the Himba, a community that has walked these dunes for hundreds of years, moving with the rhythm of the coast instead of against it. They do not fight the fog when it rolls in, or fight the sand when it shifts. They read the signs the coast leaves, follow the moisture that the fog brings, track game that has already learned to align with the land's balance. Every choice they make is rooted in what the coast gives, not what they can take from it. This is not a theory of survival. It is a lived practice, tested and refined over hundreds of generations in one of the harshest places on Earth. It proves that the transformative insight of the Skeleton Coast is not just an abstract idea. It is a working way of life that has sustained people here longer than any modern exploration has existed. The coast does not consume those who meet it on its own terms. It welcomes them and sustains them, as it has done for thousands of years. People whose presence in the broader region reflects a deep understanding of arid environments, seasonal change, and resource limitation. Their knowledge is not written in maps or measured in coordinates. It is carried in memory, in patterns of movement, in reading subtle changes in wind, vegetation, and animal behavior. In a landscape where water is rare and conditions shift constantly, survival depends on awareness that goes far beyond the surface. To outsiders, this land often appears empty, but for those who understand it, nothing here is truly empty. Every shift in sand, every change in air temperature, every movement of animals carries meaning. It is a language without words, but with structure, rhythm, and repetition. This way of understanding the environment stands in contrast to modern exploration, which often approaches the skeleton coast with technology, mapping tools, and satellite imaging. Today, researchers and expeditions move through the region with drones, GPS systems, and advanced tracking equipment. Yet even with all this precision, the land still refuses to become fully predictable. Modern expeditions reveal shipwrecks that were once unknown, hidden beneath shifting dunes, or exposed only after storms or wind changes. Aerial surveys capture images of rusted hulls far inland, confirming how far the coastline has moved over time. What once required months of dangerous travel can now be seen in minutes from above. Yet interpretation remains complex, because, even from the air, the skeleton coast does not present a fixed image. Sand moves, fog forms, light changes. What is visible in one moment may be partially hidden in the next. Technology can observe, but it cannot stabilize the environment it records. In this way, modern explorers face a different kind of challenge. Not survival in the physical sense, but understanding in the perceptual sense. The coast is not difficult to see. It is difficult to interpret. There are moments during exploration when silence becomes the dominant experience. Not the absence of sound, but a layered quiet where distant ocean waves, shifting sand, and wind currents blend into a single, continuous background. It is in these moments that the scale of the landscape becomes most apparent. Distances are deceptive here. What appears close may take hours to reach. What appears distant may suddenly emerge after a change in fog or elevation. The coastline does not present itself evenly. It reveals itself in fragments. Historical accounts from early explorers describe similar confusion long before modern instruments existed. They wrote about losing orientation even when they believed they were following known routes. They described coastlines that seemed to appear and disappear, and landmarks that changed shape depending on weather conditions. These accounts were once considered unreliable. But with modern data, many of those descriptions now make sense. The skeleton coast is not static enough to support. Every printed map draws a hard, fixed line for the skeleton coast. It is marked as a stretch of land, a defined geographic space you can point to on a globe. Travel companies list it as a destination. Researchers apply for permits to visit its coordinates, but the stories passed down through generations of people who live near its edges tell a different truth entirely. This coast is not a place. It cannot be pinned to a line or reduced to a set of latitude and longitude numbers. It is a boundary, a shifting transition zone where all the rules of certainty break down. What is solid one week is swallowed by the ocean the next. What looks like empty sand one morning becomes tangled fog by midday that hides every familiar landmark. Local storytellers do not talk about owning it or mapping it. They talk about crossing it, crossing back, and never leaving the same as when you arrived. No two trips across it ever follow the same path. It sits at the edge of everything people think they can control. On one side is the known, the named, the mapped world of human certainty. On the other, the unknown, the unfixed, the ever-changing that resists all attempts to pin it down. When modern researchers began systematic study of the region, they set out to document every feature, every process, every pattern that defined the coast. They drove steel stakes into the sand to mark fixed observation points. They anchored sensors to rocky outcrops to measure wind and tide. They expected to compile a complete, permanent record of how the place worked. Within 3 months, half the steel stakes were gone, swallowed by shifting dunes that moved 10 feet or more in a single month. The tide shifted the shoreline half a mile inward, washing out the rocky access roads that had been graded just a year earlier. Sand grains do not rest here. Dunes grow on one side, erode on the other, and crawl steadily inland year after year. The cold Atlantic current shifts constantly, pushing up different volumes of water, changing the shape of the shore with every storm. Fog rolls in off the ocean on unpredictable schedules, hiding entire sections of the coast for days at a time, then burns off without warning. Even human observation changes with the conditions. What looks like a vast empty desert from the air at noon looks like a network of hidden watercourses when the fog settles low at dawn. Every reading a researcher takes is only true for that specific moment, that specific angle, that specific set of conditions. No measurement can capture the whole, because the whole never stops moving. Complete understanding of the coast can never exist. Most observers, faced with this endless motion, assumed the skeleton coast was nothing more than random chaos. No order, no underlying pattern, just constant unstructured change. But as researchers mapped the interactions between the desert, ocean, and fog, a different pattern emerged. When the tide shifts half a mile inland after a winter storm, dunes erode twice as fast, Fog carries more salt further inland, and native plant life shifts root systems deeper to capture extra moisture from the shifting ground. When dunes crawl 10 feet inland over a year, they block old river courses, create new salt pans that draw hundreds of migratory birds, which spread native seed across the newly opened terrain. Every shift triggers a chain of adjustments that keeps the whole system balanced. The structure is not visible, not permanent. It is functional. It adapts with emotion instead of resisting it. Human presence, whether traditional or modern, is never separate from the system. Indigenous knowledge evolved over centuries of moving with the coast's shifts, adapting travel and harvesting to its changing conditions. Scientific exploration measures the momentary patterns of motion, learning from indigenous adaptation to reveal new layers of the system. Neither approach captures the whole, but both reveal different aspects of the same adaptive reality. Structure does not require permanence here. It only requires continuous adjustment.
Most explorers arrive at the Skeleton Coast chasing one thing: secrets. They come looking for what it hides, what the sand has swallowed, what the fog has kept from the world for centuries. That is the story everyone tells. That is the perspective everyone expects. But that perspective is wrong. The Skeleton Coast is not defined by what it hides. It is defined by how it changes what is seen. Every grain of sand moves every day. Every wind reshapes the shoreline faster than any map can be updated. Every tide strips away one layer of the past to lay another down in its place. And in that simple truth, a deeper understanding emerges. Knowledge of this place is not a fixed endpoint you can reach, mark on a chart, and lock away in a textbook. It is a process. It moves. It shifts. It evolves, just like the land itself. It changes with every wind, every tide, every new storm that blows across the empty shore. You cannot step into the same Skeleton Coast twice. Even the first glance you take will never match the second. Every visit rewrites the rules, and every observation challenges what you thought you knew. This is the core shift that changes everything about how we see this extraordinary place. There are places across the world where time moves in a straight, unbroken line. The past is locked away, buried under new ground, sealed behind glass, protected from the elements that would wear it away. That is not how time works here. On the Skeleton Coast, time does not push forward in one fixed direction. It folds over itself. It layers. It overlaps. It leaves traces of the distant past exposed directly in the present, for anyone who walks the shore to see. History is not hidden here behind glass or stone. It lies out in the open, shaped every single day by three unforgiving forces: wind, salt, and silence. The wind carves new edges into every fragment hour by hour. Salt eats through metal and rots wood faster than any researcher can document. Silence swallows any sound of human effort to fix or preserve what remains. Every piece of the past, every broken fragment of wreckage, every old mark on the rock tells a story. But none of these stories stay the same long enough to be fully captured, fully written down, fully understood. A shape you map today will be gone by next month, worn away or buried under 10 feet of new sand. No two observers will ever see the same history in the same place, and that uncertainty only deepens the coast's endless mystery. In recent decades, modern exploration brought new tools to solve the Skeleton Coast's old mysteries. Researchers swapped dangerous small boat voyages along unpredictable shoals for satellite imaging, high-resolution drones, and detailed aerial mapping. The expectation was simple. With these tools, we could finally map every inch of the coast, finally pin down every fragment of its past, finally achieve complete clarity. That expectation failed almost immediately. The first core task researchers set themselves was locating and cataloging every shipwreck scattered across the shore. It seemed like a straightforward goal on paper. Satellite cameras capture the entire coast in a single pass. Drones can zoom in to resolve even small fragments of wreckage. But the Skeleton Coast does not stay still for its close-up. Sand movement across the coast reshapes the surface every single week, faster than any research team can update their datasets. A wreck clearly visible in satellite images from one dry season can be completely buried under shifting dunes by the next rainy season. Another wreck, never before recorded, can emerge suddenly after a single major storm, its wooden ribs exposed where there was only open sand 6 months prior. No data set is ever complete. No map is ever final. Even with the most advanced technology humanity has ever built, the skeleton coast continues to resist every attempt to pin it down, to label it, to fully understand it. It will not be fixed. It will not be captured. It will keep shifting, keep evolving, keep changing, long after we have packed up our tools and gone.
Years of being hidden, the coastline does not preserve evidence in a fixed way. It rearranges it. Aerial surveys have revealed something even more striking. Some wrecks are located far inland, far beyond where the ocean currently reaches. These discoveries confirm what earlier explorers suspected but could never fully document. The coastline itself has shifted over time. What was once shoreline is now desert. What was once ocean access is now sand. Among these discoveries are vessels that appear frozen in transition, metal hulls resting at odd angles, broken masts casting thin shadows across dunes, rusted frames partially submerged in sand that continues to move around them. From above, these sites resemble markings on a constantly changing map. But even modern mapping struggles here. The skeleton coast does not align neatly with fixed coordinates. Fog can obscure satellite imagery. Light reflection off sand can distort perception. Even digital models require constant updates to remain accurate. This is not a failure of technology. It is a reflection of the environment itself. The coastline is not designed to remain still long enough for permanent documentation. On the ground, exploration is slower and more uncertain. Expeditions move carefully through shifting terrain, aware that paths may not remain the same from one visit to the next. What appears stable can change within days. Sand dunes migrate. Wind patterns reshape visibility. Even landmarks can become unrecognizable over time. Yet despite these challenges, researchers continue to uncover remarkable findings. Shipwreck sites provide insight not only into maritime history, but into environmental transformation. Each wreck is a marker of both human journey and natural change. Some ships tell stories of trade routes that once passed near this coast. Others reflect exploration attempts that ended abruptly in fog or shallow waters. Each one represents a moment where global movement intersected with one of the most unpredictable coastlines on Earth. One of the most compelling aspects of these discoveries is the contrast between expectation and reality. A ship designed for ocean travel now sits in complete desert silence. A vessel once dependent on wind and navigation now depends entirely on sand for its position. In many cases, researchers must reconstruct stories from fragments. A piece of hull here, a scattered cargo item there. Corrosion has erased much of the original structure, leaving interpretation dependent on careful analysis rather than complete evidence. This process is slow and uncertain. Unlike traditional archaeology, where layers remain relatively fixed, the skeleton coast continues to move while being studied. It is as if the subject of study refuses to remain in place long enough to be fully understood. Yet this instability is also what makes it unique. It is not a frozen archive. It is an active system where history continues to interact with environment. Even the act of documentation becomes part of the transformation. Footprints in sand are temporary. Markers shift. Environmental conditions alter visibility. Each visit produces a different version of the same location. From an aerial perspective, patterns begin to emerge. Lines of wreckage aligned with former shoreline positions. Clusters of debris indicating areas of repeated grounding. Subtle shifts in dune structure revealing the long-term movement of sand across decades. These patterns suggest that the skeleton coast is not just a place where accidents happened. It is a place where geography itself has been in motion long enough to rewrite those accidents into new positions. Despite this constant change, there is continuity in how the coastline behaves. Fog still forms along the cold Benguela Current. Wind still drives sand inland. The ocean still reshapes the edge of land. The system remains active, even if its results are always changing. Modern explorers often describe a sense of humility when working here. Technology provides data, but not certainty. Maps provide reference, but not stability. Every conclusion remains temporary, subject to revision as the environment evolves. And yet, this uncertainty does not diminish understanding. It deepens it, because what becomes clear over time is not a single fixed picture. but a process. A coastline defined not by what it is, but by how it behaves. One idea becomes increasingly important. The skeleton coast does not preserve history in the way humans expect. It continues it, reshaping every trace of the past into something that belongs equally to land, sea, and time. There are places where journeys don't end. They dissolve into something quieter, something deeper, something that stays long after the footsteps are gone. The skeleton coast is one of those places, a coastline that never truly stops changing, where every wave, every grain of sand, and every breath of fog continues rewriting the story without asking for permission. As this final chapter unfolds across Skeleton Coast, the focus is no longer just on shipwrecks, survival, or exploration. It becomes something more reflective, a confrontation with time itself, because here, nothing is final. Not the wrecks, not the dunes, not even the coastline. Everything exists in transition, as if the entire region is suspended between states, never fully arriving, never fully leaving. The ocean continues its cold, steady movement along the Atlantic edge. The Benguela Current carries deep, freezing waters upward, shaping not just the sea, but the air above it. Fog still forms without warning, rolling in like a silent curtain that erases distance and memory in the same motion. And the desert continues its slow expansion. Sand does not rush here. It advances patiently, carried by wind patterns that have not changed for thousands of years. It buries what is exposed and reveals what was once hidden, without preference or pattern. This is why the skeleton coast cannot be. Continues its cold, steady movement along the Atlantic edge. The Benguela Current carries deep, freezing waters upward, shaping not just the sea, but the air above it. Fog still forms without warning, rolling in like a silent curtain that erases distance and memory in the same motion. And the desert continues its slow expansion. Sand does not rush here. It advances patiently, carried by wind patterns that have not changed for thousands of years. It buries what is exposed and reveals what was once hidden, without preference or pattern. This is why the skeleton coast cannot be understood in a single moment. It must be experienced as a sequence of disappearances and returns, a coastline that never looks the same twice. Standing here, it becomes clear that the shipwrecks are not the only thing shaped by this environment. Perception itself changes. What seems permanent begins to feel temporary. What seems solid begins to feel conditional. Even the idea of a fixed landscape starts to weaken. A rusted hull half buried in sand is not just a remnant of maritime history. It is a marker of time passing through matter. It shows how human intention, no matter how strong, eventually becomes part of a larger system that does not pause for interpretation. Some wrecks remain partially visible for decades. Others disappear entirely, only to reappear later in altered positions. There is no fixed archive here, only shifting evidence. Even silence behaves differently. It is not empty. It is not empty. It is layered with wind pressure, distant surf, and the subtle movement of sand across metal and stone. Sometimes it feels complete, as if the world has paused. And then, without warning, sound returns in fragments, rebuilding the sense of space again. This rhythm of disappearance and return defines everything here. The coastline itself behaves like a breathing system, expanding, contracting, revealing, concealing, never static, never complete. And within this system, human presence feels temporary in a very specific way, not insignificant, but transient. Every trace of passage becomes part of a process that continues without needing acknowledgement. Yet there is something deeply powerful in that realization, because it shifts the meaning of exploration. It is no longer about conquering space or documenting it completely. It becomes about witnessing change without expecting permanence. Even modern technology, with all its precision, cannot fully stabilize what exists here. Satellite images capture moments, not conditions. Drones reveal structure, but not transformation. Every dataset becomes outdated the moment the wind shifts. And still, exploration continues, because the value is not in completion. It is in observation. In understanding that the skeleton coast is not a place that can be fully mapped, but a process that can only be followed. As the light begins to fade across the dunes, shadows stretch longer, and contrast returns to the landscape. The ocean darkens. The sand cools. Fog begins to gather again at the edge of perception. And in that moment, everything feels connected. The wrecks, the wind, the fog, the desert, the sea, not as separate elements, but as parts of a single, continuous system that has been moving long before any human story began here. There is no final discovery waiting at the end of this coastline, no single truth that explains it all. Instead, there is understanding in fragments, a recognition that some places are not meant to be solved, but experienced repeatedly, in different conditions, at different times. The skeleton coast does not offer closure. It offers perspective. It reminds you that even the most permanent structures are temporary in the right conditions. That history is not something stored, but something continuously rewritten by the environment itself. And as this journey comes to its end, the final realization is simple, but lasting. The skeleton coast is not defined by shipwrecks, or fog, or desert, or ocean alone. It is defined by the relationship between all of them. A relationship that never stops moving, never stops changing, never stops becoming something slightly different from what it was before. And in that endless transformation, the coast remains exactly what it has always been, a place where nothing truly ends, because everything is always becoming something else. There are places where truth and imagination begin to overlap so closely that separating them no longer feels necessary. On the skeleton coast, stories are not just told, they are carried by wind, shaped by silence, and stretched by distance until they become something between memory and myth. As this journey continues across Skeleton Coast, the focus shifts away from what can be measured and seen, and toward what has been believed, feared, and passed on through generations. Because long before satellite maps and modern navigation, this coastline already existed in the human imagination as something unstable, unpredictable, and almost beyond reach. For sailors approaching from the Atlantic, the coast did not always appear as land. Sometimes it appeared as absence, a break in understanding, a place where familiar rules of navigation no longer applied. And when communication failed, and ships did not return, stories began to fill the gaps left behind. Some of these stories were practical at first. Warnings passed between crews, descriptions of sudden fog walls, accounts of shifting sandbanks, notes about currents that pulled ships closer to shore even when sails pointed away. But over time, repetition transformed warning into legend. The skeleton coast began to take on a different identity. Not just a dangerous shoreline, but a place that seemed to resist being fully known. A coast that erased direction, then erased certainty, then erased the difference between what was seen and what was assumed. In isolation, imagination grows quickly. Sailors who survived journeys near this region often returned with fragmented accounts. They spoke of hearing sounds that could not be placed, of seeing shapes in fog that disappeared when approached, of moments where the sea and sky seemed to merge into a single gray surface with no boundary at all. And from these accounts, stories multiplied. Some said the coast was cursed, a place where navigation itself failed, for reasons beyond natural explanation. Others believed it was inhabited by spirits of lost sailors, guiding or misleading ships depending on forces no one could understand. There were even tales of phantom vessels, ships seen briefly through fog, fully formed yet silent, only to vanish without trace when approached. Whether optical illusion or memory distortion, these stories became part of the coastline's identity. Even today, echoes of these legends remain attached to the region, not because they are proven, but because the environment itself encourages uncertainty. Fog that appears without warning, silence that feels unnatural, distances that shift perception. These conditions blur the line between observation and interpretation. Yet beneath the myth, there is a physical reality that explains why imagination took root so easily here. The environment itself is extreme in ways that affect perception directly. Cold ocean currents reduce visibility. Dense fog limits orientation. Sand movement alters familiar shapes. When all reference points are unstable, the human mind begins to fill gaps. It constructs meaning where clarity is missing. And in a place like this, those constructions become stories. But the skeleton coast does not confirm or deny them. It simply continues behaving as it always has, indifferent to interpretation. Some of the most enduring legends are tied to shipwrecks that were never fully explained, vessels that vanished from records, ships that were found far from expected routes, debris that appeared without clear origin. Each fragment became a point of speculation, extended over time into narrative. Even modern exploration, with all its precision, cannot fully eliminate this layer of mystery. Because while data can show location and structure, it cannot fully capture the experience of being inside shifting fog, where orientation itself becomes unreliable. In that sense, the skeleton coast exists on two levels at once. the physical and the perceived, the mapped and the remembered. And between those two layers, stories continue to form. Some of them are rooted in fear, others in awe, many in simple human attempts to explain what could not be controlled. Because when a coastline repeatedly erases ships, alters direction, and transforms landscapes over time, explanation becomes more than curiosity. It becomes necessity. But over time, something changes in how these stories are understood. What once seemed supernatural begins to appear environmental. What once seemed mystical begins to reveal patterns. Fog linked to cold currents. Sand movement driven by wind system.
You stand at the edge of Skeleton Coast, boot soles digging into cool, dry sand. 10 seconds ago, the horizon was a sharp line between blue ocean and pale sky. You could count the rocks half a mile out, watch the white surf break in steady rhythm. Then the fog comes. It doesn't drift, it rolls. It moves faster than any coastal fog you've ever seen, swallowing the distant rocks first, then the line of the breakers. Your ears ring first. The crash of waves fades, softens, melts into a cold, thick, layered silence that wraps around you like wool. You step forward one pace, testing the ground under your feet. Where sand ends and water begins, you can no longer tell. The wet glint of incoming tide blends into damp sand. No edge, no division. The horizon is gone entirely. Up and down, left and right, land and sea all blur into the same pale gray. You can't tell how far anything is. A rock 3 feet away looks as distant as the last headland you saw an hour ago. Every fixed point you relied on just vanished without a trace. There's only the gray, the silence, and the quiet, unshakable sense that something is just out of sight, just beyond the fog. For centuries, visitors and scholars have explained away the coast legends as simple error, navigation mistakes caused by bad visibility, sailors misreading distances, stories growing with each retelling until fact turned into myth. That explanation makes perfect sense on paper. It answers every question about how the legends started, but it misses one critical point. Understanding how the feeling forms does not make the feeling go away. When you stand here, even with a GPS in your pocket, even with a detailed map of every rock and current in your hand, the uncertainty does not vanish. It only shifts. You know where you are on paper, but in your body, in the fog and the silence, distance still feels wrong. Boundaries still blur. The coast never stops shifting. Sand dunes move with every storm. The tide pulls sand away and deposits it somewhere new overnight. Headlands erode. Currents change direction. New channels open where old ones closed. Reality here is never fixed. It is always conditional, always in motion. The myths did not pop up because people had no facts. The myths popped up because the facts themselves create the space for uncertainty. The ever-changing, unsteady nature of this coastline is the condition that lets imagination take root. That is the core truth most explanations miss. Myth did not replace fact here. Fact grew myth. Legends do not replace truth here. They reflect how humans respond to places that refuse simple answers. They remain, not as lies to be corrected by modern exploration, but as echoes of the experience this coast gives anyone who stands within its fog. Even now, with satellite mapping, with continuous weather monitoring, with every ship's navigation system updated by the second, the coastline still leaves space for uncertainty. It does not hide anything on purpose. It just never stops changing long enough to be fully pinned down, fully concluded, fully explained. Between what we know from data and what we feel standing in the fog, between a finished map and the shifting ground under our feet, that space remains. And in that space, the stories keep living. They do not pretend to be answers. They are just the echo of a place that has always been slightly beyond full human understanding. Most journeys end when you arrive at your destination, when you pin down every fact, when you answer every question. But some journeys do not end with a final answer. They end with a deeper understanding of how much wonder there is in what we cannot fully hold. At the Skeleton Coast, the stories do not die when exploration ends. They keep breathing, right there, in the gap between knowledge and experience, waiting for the next time fog rolls in and blurs the line between land and sea again.
The Skeleton Coast belongs to neither. It does not offer closure in the way people expect from a destination. Instead, it leaves behind a feeling that something is still moving, even after everything seems still. As the final stretch of this journey unfolds across Skeleton Coast, the landscape begins to feel less like a location and more like a presence. Not something that can be fully captured, but something that continues to exist in motion even when no one is watching. The ocean is still here, pressing against the edge of the continent with the same cold persistence that has shaped it for thousands of years. The Benguela Current continues its unseen path beneath the surface, carrying deep water upward, shaping fog, shaping temperature, shaping everything above it, without ever revealing itself directly. The desert is still here too, extending inward in vast silence. Sand moves without sound, driven by winds that have no beginning or end. Dunes shift slowly, altering outlines that once seemed permanent. What appears solid is always temporary. What appears fixed is always in transition. Between these two forces, the coastline exists as a threshold rather than a boundary, a space where land and sea do not separate cleanly, but continuously exchange roles. And within this space, everything that has been seen across this journey still remains present in some form. The wrecks are still there, even when buried. The fog still forms, even when unseen. The wildlife still moves through patterns shaped by survival. The stories still exist, even when reduced to fragments. But what becomes most clear in this final moment is not any single feature of the coast. It is the relationship between all of them. The shipwrecks are not isolated accidents. They are part of a system where visibility fails, where currents shift, where sand moves, where time alters geography itself. The desert is not separate from the ocean. It is shaped by it. The fog is not separate from the air. It is created by its collision with cold water. Everything here is connected through motion. Nothing operates alone. Even human presence, whether past or present, becomes part of this system. Ships become structures in sand. Exploration becomes temporary observation. Memory becomes interpretation shaped by environment. And as time continues, even these distinctions begin to fade. There is something humbling about this coastline that does not come from scale alone, but from continuity. It does not need to dominate. It does not need to announce itself. It simply continues. Long after ships are gone, long after names are forgotten, long after stories have changed form. In many places, endings feel like conclusions. Here, endings feel like transitions. A shipwreck is not a final moment. It is a beginning of transformation. A shoreline is not a fixed line. It is a moving agreement between forces. A landscape is not a surface. It is a process unfolding in real time. And that is why this place stays in memory differently. Not as a collection of sights, but as a pattern of change. There is a final kind of silence here that is not emptiness, but depth. It is the silence of systems working without interruption. Wind shaping sand, water shaping air, temperature shaping visibility. Everything continuing without pause, regardless of observation. Standing here, it becomes clear that the Skeleton Coast does not need to be fully understood to be experienced. In fact, it resists full understanding by design. Not intentionally, but structurally. Because nothing here is built for permanence. And so the final reflection is not about discovery. It is about acceptance of movement itself. That the coast is not a place that was explored and completed. It is a place that continues to unfold. That every wreck is part of a longer cycle. Every fog bank is part of a larger system. Every dune is part of a shifting architecture that never settles into final form. And in that realization, something shifts in perspective. The idea of control becomes smaller. The idea of permanence becomes less important. What remains is awareness of continuity. The Skeleton Coast does not end when the camera leaves. It does not end when the story finishes. It continues in wind patterns, in ocean currents, in sand movement, in fog formation, in silence that repeats itself without repetition ever being identical. And so, the final image is not a conclusion, it is movement. A coastline that is always becoming. Something slightly different from what it was a moment before. A place where nothing truly ends, because everything is always in the process of changing into something else. The skeleton coast doesn't end when the camera stops. It continues. In the wind moving across empty dunes, in the rusted remains of ships no one remembers arriving, and in the cold Atlantic waters that still shape everything they touch. This is not just a coastline. It is a reminder that nature does not need permission to reclaim what exists on it. That time does not preserve, it transforms. And that even the strongest human journeys eventually become part of the landscape they tried to cross. Some places on Earth are not meant to be conquered. They are meant to be understood, slowly, carefully, from a distance that still respects their power. And the Skeleton Coast is one of them. If this journey changed the way you see the world, then you were never just watching a place. You were watching time itself, move through land, sea, and silence. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed exploring Prague as much as I enjoyed guiding you through it. If you found this travel guide helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more beautiful destinations from around the world. Got a favorite spot in Prague? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, safe travels, and see you in the next video.